To give us a little bit more insight into this application process, we are joined today by Arkesh Patel, the COO of Crimson Education, and Ivo Lima, who heads up Indigo Research, a company within the Crimson brand. A little bit about Arkesh. Arkesh is a superstar. He has led top technology firms at like Lyft and Thumbtack and comes from a consulting background at Bain. He got his MBA from Harvard Business School as a 2+2 admit after receiving his bachelor's in chemistry from the University of Cambridge. Go ahead and say hello to everyone, Arkesh, and I'll hop over.
Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. Second, we're joined by Ivo Lima, a former classmate of mine, actually, at Stanford. Ivo has had an incredible journey coming from Brazil, where he's helped hundreds of students get accepted into the most prestigious universities, both postgraduate and undergraduate. He also has an amazing background working in finance and in the third sector, being a former associate at Bank of America.
Hey, everyone. Really excited to be here tonight.
Awesome. Great. So first off, we're going to talk about why did Arkesh and Ivo pursue a deferred MBA admission? How did they learn about it? So I'll kick it off to you first, Arkesh. When and how did you first learn about deferred MBA programs while you were an undergrad?
Yeah, sure. So Shadman covered a little bit of my background, but just to recap. So I did my undergrad at the University of Cambridge, and I studied a course there called Natural Sciences. So it was a very broad array of sciences, which I eventually specialized into chemistry. I did an internship after my first year in the UK, sort of freshman year, where I worked for Pfizer's regenerative medicine unit out in Cambridge. So it was a very kind of lab-heavy, science-heavy internship that I did, and very quickly realized that even though I was studying the sciences, probably was not the best fit for someone in the lab. And I think in the back of my mind, during that internship, like a lot of what really excited me about that experience was more understanding everything there was to know about like Pfizer as a company and how the company operated, how the company made decisions, how the business actually worked. And so that naturally jived with a natural interest I had always had in kind of business and enterprises. And so, following that experience in my second summer, after my second year, I actually went into management consulting and did an internship in consulting. And that really solidified my interest in pursuing a career in business. Around that time, I had also actually read a pretty famous book called What They Teach You at Harvard Business School. I think I was always very curious about what business school was all about. It's a pretty fascinating book for those of you who are interested in learning more about Harvard in particular and like the philosophy of the business school and how they teach business. And so I started researching, how does this work? And there were a lot of benefits that were advertised as part of the program. I think one of them in particular was this idea of, lock in your admission early, and that can provide you a lot of flexibility down the road. And I really took advantage of that flexibility. I'll share a little bit more about that later, but I really liked that aspect of kind of locking something in early and not having to worry about it later. I also had spoken with a couple of folks as part of my consulting internship who really recommended that, like, hey, if this program exists, and you have to remember this was that when you're an undergrad, it's just so much easier to kind of fit that in. And so that was a real sell for me as well. Just a lot of mentors of mine who were applying for an MBA themselves through a normal program telling me, if you're in school right now, like you should just do it right now. Like while you're in the mode of kind of test taking, while you're in the mode of essay writing, lock it in, and then you don't have to worry about it later. And so that was a huge sell for me. And looking back, I'm so glad that I took advantage of that opportunity, even though the deferred MBA program at Harvard was so nascent at that point in time.
That's great. Ivo, Arkesh touched on this a little bit too, but would love to hear when in undergrad did you first learn about deferred MBAs and why did you ultimately decide to apply?
Yeah, so I was very involved during college with Brasa, right? This nonprofit helping low-income Brazilian students get into universities abroad. And it operated both to undergrad and to postgraduate degrees. So I was always looking at these different kinds of programs and opportunities in different schools, some of which had like different formats. And I heard about the 2+2. It was the most famous program. And then Stanford had a deferred enrollment program, which had a little bit less structure to it. It had a little bit more flexibility. Yale had a different program where you actually started, it was a 1-year gap rather than, it was different. You started, then you took a gap, then you went back to it. So I started looking at the designs of these programs because I was interested in it from a Brasa perspective. And I realized that it was actually a really good fit. So I started studying more about these programs, how they worked, what an application would look like. And I decided to apply actually very close to the deadline. If there's one thing that I could change is I would have made that decision earlier on. Really, like I think applying to 2+2 is a no-brainer. There's literally no disadvantage to getting in early. That being said, I think the fact that I ended up deciding to do it so close to the deadline also goes to show that there's a lot that can be done even in just a couple of weeks. So Shadman, when you mentioned that you're eyeing helping people apply also to the April deadlines, I think that's actually a very worthwhile effort. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I'm super excited to dig in more just in the differences. That does kind of bring us, Ivo kind of jumped the gun, so I'll stick with you a bit here, Ivo, is why was there that delta? You learned about the program and then you didn't ultimately apply until right before the deadline. Why did that happen? And given such a short time frame, how did you decide, okay, this is how I'm going to apply, this is my process? Walk me through senior year Ivo and how he was thinking through his application process while still finishing undergrad.
Yeah, of course. So let's say I heard about these programs somewhere around second or third year. And I mean, it was cool. The idea of doing an MBA was interesting. So I started looking at it. Then during my last summer in college, I interned at Bank of America, and I've always been really good with numbers. I always liked quick, environments with a lot of pressure. So I thought I would thrive there. I interned there. I did well. I got a returning offer, but I wasn't really in love. And I started thinking, okay, what happens if I decide to join this thing, and then 2 or 3 years from now, I realize that's not actually what I want to do for the rest of my life? What would a job search look like? And in my case, as an international student, I only had a limited time of visa, right? So visa was also a consideration. So with all those things in mind, what I thought was, let me look more seriously into these programs and apply to them. But by that time, when I started looking very seriously, that was already senior year. So my 4th year in college. During senior year, I would spend most of my days just focusing on school. So one of the most important things that you can do to boost your chances is getting a good GPA and having your extracurriculars. So I was focusing on my school, focusing in Braza, which is the nonprofit that I was running. And I would simply read on Reddit or watch videos on YouTube about people who were applying to MBAs. All kinds of videos, all kinds of stories, just trying to get a feel of what those applications looked like, what were good candidates, what were bad candidates. So in a way, I was preparing my brain for that last effort that I did very close to the deadline. I was already getting familiar with what was required of me and putting a lot of effort into getting a good a good GPA and doing well in my extracurriculars. So when I decided to apply, Chicago is in the quarter system. I actually had finals in between during that period. I had midterms and finals during that period. So it was very stressful. And the way I didn't do any planning, right? At that point, I was like, okay, now I have to do everything at once and just study for the GRE and do my finals and focus the process. That being said, I think that it is definitely true that I would much rather study for the GRE or GMAT during school, even if it's during finals, than when you're working 70 hours a week in consulting. So I definitely want to echo that point that Arkesh made. You're just in the right mindset, right, to study. You're used to test taking, you're used to the kind of environment. It's just part of your routine. So it's definitely the best time to prepare for these exams. I've even heard of people who are not sure yet if they want to apply to 2+2 or not. And then what they do is just take the exam. Right? Take the exam. If you decide to apply later on, you already have your grade. If you decide to apply now, you have all that you need. So getting ready for the exam and doing it as soon as you can before graduating college is also a no-brainer, in my opinion.
So before we hop over to Arkesh, I just want to clarify, how long did you prep for the GMAT? And then how much time did you end up spending, and how many weeks before submitting your application?
Ooh, I don't know if there are going to be questions specifically about test taking, but I didn't take the GMAT. I took the GRE. And I think that's a very interesting distinction that I think you have to be very strategic in choosing which one you want to take. I prepped for the GRE for about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. It was very short, a very short period.
So Arkesh, walk us through the other perspective. It sounds like you were familiar with the Harvard's program a lot earlier in your undergraduate cycle, and assuming you had a little bit more time in preparation. What was that process like?
I certainly knew of the Harvard program earlier in my undergraduate journey. However, Cambridge is a 3-year degree program, and from the Q&A, I can see we have a couple of folks actually from the UK who have questions around this. Being in a 3-year degree program does make things a little bit more tricky because you're essentially applying for one of these deferred MBA or 2+2 programs in your final year of college, and if you have 3 years, then if you start working backwards, you really need to be starting pretty soon after you start college, which I know can feel really daunting for some folks, right? You just spent a lot of time and energy to get into the college that you're now attending, and then a year in or a year and a half in, you're kind of revving up again for another application process. But as Ivo mentioned, I think so much of the process is easier to do when you're actually in school, not just the test taking, the essay writing, getting recommendations, all of that is just much more of a school environment mindset, I think, versus the working world. But for me, so when I was at Cambridge, started to plan out like, how do I want to go about this? I decided to take the GMAT when I was at Cambridge. I also, I would say, spent about like 2 weeks of really like intensive prep for the GMAT. I actually did it over my spring break. And most of that was because like I found just like the academic program at Cambridge like pretty challenging throughout the year. And so I figured like, it's really hard to squeeze in like, when should I do the GMAT? Like, let me dedicate like 2 weeks to really nail it. Short answer is I thought I was planning early. It still got a little crunched because of the 3-year kind of timeline. And so my strong advice is, start early. There's pieces that you can get going on sooner. There's some pieces that you'll be limited on and you'll want to start a little bit later. But if you say really knock out, the GMAT or the GRE, get an amazing score, get that piece taken care of, and then start building out kind of your experiences, your leadership experiences, your relationships with either professors, mentors, on the job or at an internship. And then those pieces you can start to bring to fruition a little bit later, closer to the deadline as well.
I want us to dive a little bit more into the application parts. So we're going to skip down because I know both Ivo and Arkesh shared a little bit more about why they chose the programs that they did. When students are applying to 2+2 programs, are there application differences between schools? For example, does Harvard look for a different type of candidate than Stanford or Yale? I'll pass it to you, Ivo, and then Arkesh, if you want to jump in, go for it.
I think there are some slight differences. One thing I'll say is that most of the things that business schools are looking for in candidates, whether it's 2+2 or regular programs across schools, are relatively similar, right? So keeping that in mind, I do think that there are some key differences. For example, I feel that Stanford has a very strong focus on the idea of generating impact beyond yourself. That's even more true for 2+2 programs in general, including in other schools. But at Stanford, that's more true for the regular application and even more true for the 2+2. So students who may engage in a lot of extracurriculars that are all, let's say, career focused. So maybe they've created 2 or 3 career clubs in their university and they're really focused on, I don't know, leading the quant trading club in their schools or something like that. That is usually not as appealing a profile as for Stanford, in particular for the 2+2 program. So I would say that in general there are more similarities than differences, but that this is one big one.
In terms, I think I generally agree with Ivo that there's more in common kind of across schools than there are differences between schools. I know for Harvard specifically, Ivo touched on this a little bit earlier, but like when I was going through the 2+2 application process, I think a lot of other schools, including Stanford, had a lot more kind of informal programs as it pertains to like getting students in early. Harvard was the first one that really like branded its program and really went out with like the 2+2 brand and like really sought after students who came from backgrounds that are harder to essentially source, I think, in the regular rounds. And so you still see some of that reflected a little bit in the stats for 2+2 admits. So pretty heavy on, I think more than 50% of students who get into the 2+2 program at HBS are in the STEM fields, right? So engineering, math, physical sciences. And I think like a lot of that is because the genesis of the program was really to try and find some of these students, as they're finishing up their undergraduate journey and thinking about, what is that graduate school experience I want to do? And often an MBA is not as top of mind because it's not something you do immediately after undergrad, right? And so you may be thinking about another like master's in science or just some other master's program potentially rather than an MBA. And so that was the initial kind of target audience. I will say like that has changed over time, right? I think Harvard has learned that there's actually value in being able to, grab talent like early, even if it doesn't fit within that like tight STEM box. But I will say like that is definitely like a target for Harvard. And it does lend the question, if you are not a STEM applicant, how can you really differentiate yourself as you apply for deferred MBA programs? The good news is both at Crimson and just more generally, I think we've seen a number of students with, whether it's like social science, business, arts and humanities backgrounds, econ backgrounds, who have really been able to have success in deferred MBA programs. It just requires a little bit more tight focus in terms of like, what is the narrative that you want to tell about yourself to the program? Because at the end of the day, you have to remember that whether it's Harvard, whether it's Stanford, they're all thinking about this in terms of overall class body composition, right? In terms of just having a really diverse student body where everyone brings something different. And so just because you studied business or social sciences or humanities doesn't mean that you can't bring something different. You just have to really spend a lot of time to bring that out in your application. So that's just one area that I think like Harvard really started with the STEM focus, but I wouldn't say that's truly defining of the program at all, both even when it started and certainly not now.
Yeah. And
if I may add one point is I think Arkesh is totally right that like even the names of the programs suggest these differences, right? So So when you look at the 2+2, it was originally like a very clear formula, where Stanford was just called deferred enrollment. And that was, you could ask for anywhere between 1 to 5 years, and it wasn't even clearly targeted necessarily at college students. It might be people wanting to take a deferred enrollment for whatever reason it is. And I actually know of people who applied to the deferred enrollment without being in college, although they are very, very rare, applied and got in at Stanford. And then, of course, there's like Yale, which I mentioned, right? Like you started the program, then took a gap, then went back to the program, the Silver Scholars, I think is what it was called. So those things definitely change a lot, the admissions.
Makes me wonder a lot at different parts of the application process. And I'm curious to think about candidacy differentiation. You know, what do you think were the needle movers for you as applicants that got you in? And if there were any other students that got in from your school into a 2+2 program, what do you think differentiated them?
I could start on this one. In terms of my own candidacy, in terms of getting into a 2+2 program, it's actually a perfect segue from the topic that I was just discussing, because as Shadman mentioned, and as I covered myself, I was a chemistry major when I was at Cambridge. As I mentioned, I worked at that regenerative medicine stem cell unit at Pfizer my first summer. And even though as chief operating officer of Crimson, I've clearly strayed quite a bit in terms of my initial kind of career aspirations. And I think that's totally fine, right? You never know what careers entail until you really get into them. For me at that point in time, I was really interested in that intersection of kind of healthcare, biotech, and business, right? And so I had that experience, that internship that was really defining. One of my recommendation letters actually was from my main supervisor on the job, who I think was able to speak to not only just like, you know, my performance in the very specific, like very scientific, like lab field that I was in, but also all of the things that I did outside of my day-to-day job that clearly indicated intellectual curiosity and interest in the business side and being more of a leader, et cetera. And so I think my recommendation letter from that internship like really helped create a cohesive story, right? The story where, you know, I was this kind of chemistry and biology student interested in leadership. And I created like a really kind of tight profile, I would say, all around that. And even though this isn't the exact question, I'll touch on this, another point that I want to make as well, which is even though I clearly strayed a little bit from the path that I had painted for myself in applying to business school, you know, I went off to do management consulting at Bain in San Francisco for 2 years, but I really took advantage of the 2+2 program and the fact that I was already admitted to Harvard Business School to, after my 2 years, join a 30-person healthcare startup in San Francisco. And this was exactly like what I wanted this program to enable me to do. And it was actually consistent with the narrative that I had shared with the school, right? Which is, you know, I'm really interested in that intersection between like sciences and healthcare and business. And I'm so glad that because I had that Harvard MBA kind of locked down, I then was able to almost like live out the narrative that I had shared that got me into the school.
I just really like that last point that Arkesh made. I used to call it a golden insurance, right? Like I can take however much risk I want. If everything fails, I'll go to Stanford and get an MBA, which is literally a dream come true. So I definitely like the ability to take risk that you get after getting into a 2+2. So I think that I was a solid candidate overall, right? So like the GPA above a 3.7, doing math, so a STEM field, getting really good standardized scores, standardized test scores. I was dedicating probably way more time to Brasa than I was to school, and that was an NGO helping people, helping make the world a better place, and it related very closely to my own personal story. So it was very easy for me to make my entire effort very personal, which I think is very powerful. I think that my recommendation letters probably played a really important role. I asked recommenders who I was really close to. And again, if you're working, it's hard for you to ask your boss to write your recommendation letter to an MBA program, because that means you might be leaving their company. If you're in a place like consulting where it's more common, maybe yes, but in other companies, people struggle to find recommenders. Because I was in college, it was actually very easy for me to find recommenders, people who were very close to me and who had been very close to me for a while. And I actually sent them very detailed anecdotes of times that we had discussed in the past or that we had worked together in the past that highlighted characteristics that I strategically wanted them to emphasize in the recommendation letters. And I hope that they did just that, and that helped me get in. So I think that getting good recommendation letters is very important. And two more things. One is I had a very good recommendation for why I needed to take a gap before applying to school. So right, like why don't you just wait the 2 years and then apply to an MBA? I had a very good story to tell as to why I actually needed that right now. And the second thing is my entire application was about how I was talking not about the things that I was achieving at Brazza or at school or in achieving my big dream of changing the world, but it was about the many ways that I was failing and how an MBA would help me to stop failing in those things and become a better person and achieve more and impact the world in a better way. And I think that framing of putting the MBA at the core of how that's going to allow you to create more impact in the world was very important to my application.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, thank you all. And thanks again to our audience. And we're looking forward to working with you soon. Take care.